was in the 5th grade, I bought an issue of DC Comics Presents number 57. I have a spinner rack at my local bookstore, and that comic book changed my life. The combination of words and picture did something inside my head that had never been done before, and I immediately fell in love with the medium of comics. I became a voracious comic book reader, but I never brought them to the school. Instinctively, I knew that comic books didn't belong in the classroom. After all, my teacher and my parents never used them to teach. It was so I kept reading comics, and I even started making them. Eventually, I became a published cartoonist, writing and drawing comic books for a living. I also became a high school teacher. This is where I taught. Bishop Adult High School in Oakland, California. I taught a little bit of math and a little bit of art, but mostly computer science. When I was a brand new teacher, I tried bringing comic books into my classroom. I remember telling my students on the first day of every class that I was also a cartoonist. Comic books didn't have the cultural cassette that they do today. And when stuff got hard in my class, they would use comic books as a way of distracting me. They would raise their hands and ask the questions like, "Mrs. Annisa, who do you think will win in a fight? Superman or the Hulk?" I very quickly realized I had to keep my teaching and my cartooning separate. It seemed like my instincts in 5th grade were correct. Comic books didn't belong in the classroom. But again, I was wrong. A few years into my teaching career, I learned firsthand that educational potential of comics. Then I have algebra student, and that was my terrible. I mean, having a long-term sub is bad enough, but having a sub for your sub, that's the worst. So to provide some sort of consistent for my students, I begged on videotaping myself giving lectures. I'd give this video to my sub to play for my students. I tried to make this video as engaging as possible. But these video lectures were a disaster. I had students coming up to me and saying things like, "Miss Annisa, we thought you were boring in person, but on video you are just unbearable." So, as a desperate second attempt, I began drawing this lecture as comics. I do this very quickly with very little planning, draw one panel after the other, figuring out what I wanted to say as I want. These comic lectures would come out to anywhere between 4 and 6 pages long. I gave them to my sub to hand to my students, and much to my surprise, these comic lectures were a hit. My students liked my comics a lot. It was even like they liked cartoon me more than actual me. Because of that, I began to understand the education potential of comics. First, unlike the math textbooks, these comic lectures taught visually. Our students grow up in a visual culture, so they are used to take information that way. But unlike other visual narratives, like film or television or video, comics are what I call permanent. Because when my students didn't understand something in my comics lecture, they could just reread that passage as quickly or as slowly as they needed. The same was not true of my video lectures. When I speak, I deliver the information as quickly or slowly as I want. So, for certain students and certain kinds of information, these two aspects of the comics medium, its visual nature and permanent, make it an incredible, powerful educational tool. In 1944, the Journal of Educational Sociology even devoted an entire issue to this topic. Teachers were starting to figure things out, but then along comes this guy. This is child psychologist Dr. Frederick Wetham, and in 1954 he wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent, where he argues that comic book cause juvenile delinquency. He was wrong. Now, Dr. Wetham was actually a pretty decent guy. He spent most of his career working with juvenile delinquents, and in his work he noticed that most of his clients read comic books. What Dr. Wetham failed to realize was in the 1940s and 50s, almost every kid in America read comic books. At Bishop Adult, where I used to teach, Mr. Smith, one of my former colleagues, uses Cut McCloud's Understanding Comics because that book gives his students the language with which to discuss the relationship between words and image. So there's no good reason to keep comic books and graphic novels out of K-12 education. They teach visually. They give our students that remote control. The educational potential is there, just waiting to be tapped by creative people like you. Thank you.